Hi, I'm Bianca Johnson, and I am the CEO and lead tech VA and trainer at WAM Workspace. And today I wanted to chat to you a little bit about domains, emails, and websites, your place in the online space. This is really important to me. It's something that comes up quite a lot for our clients. And I feel that it's a really important thing that we chat about so that you really understand how it all works together. So firstly, I want to chat about the anatomy of an email address. And often this is where people get confused. They're not quite sure what each part of it means. And so I think it's really useful to kind of explain how all of it works. So in an email address, you have the part that comes before the @ sign, which is the name. And that is the unique identifying aspect of the email address. And so your the part before the @ sign is going to decide who the email is going to, based on all the people that are on the domain. The @ sign is the part that really tells the internet that this is an email address and we're not sending someone to a website, we're not sending someone to server or something like that. This needs to be routed to an email address. And then the domain or URL is the part at the end. So the WAM workspace in this case is our domain, and the .com tells us the kind of domain that it is, if that makes sense. So .com refers to a commercial company and is an international sign. We're getting more and more of those now. And so you can now get things like .me, .info, and it's becoming more interesting to sort of figure those sorts of things out. So you have to pay a little bit more attention now. Most countries have their own. So in South Africa, it's .co.za for a company or .org.za for an organization. .edu.za would be for an educational institute, and certain domains are limited to the kinds of companies or businesses that can use that domain. So this end part tells the internet where the main information is served, and I'm going to get into that a little bit more because it's then we're going to explain all of it. But I think it's important to kind of understand the anatomy of the email address. And it is possible to set up things that are called a catch-all email. So if you get the front part wrong, or if someone who's trying to email you gets the front part wrong, it will then still find the email and send it to whoever the administrator is on that domain for those email addresses. But if they get the second part wrong, then there's no chance of that being delivered correctly, because it's either going to go to whoever owns the incorrectly spelt domain, or it's going to go into the ether, because there is no domain for what someone has spelled. So that's why it's so important to get an email address correct. So if we now look at the domain, your domain is your internet address. It's kind of like the post office box. You rent it annually to be able to use that name. And there are DNS settings, and I'll go into that shortly, that tell people where to go depending on what they use around that domain. So some examples of domains are our wamworkspace.com and wamworkspace.co.za. So we have two websites. We have an international website and we have a South African website. Others are things like google.com. And then you get things that are subdomains. So here we've got mail.google.com or m.facebook.com. So m.facebook.com tells the internet, show the mobile version of Facebook on that domain rather than the desktop version. Mail.google.com is going to take you to Google's email platform, Gmail, because you're not just going to Google to search, you want to go and look at your emails. YouTube will take you to YouTube. Everything that happens after this, so the slash anything else that comes after that, is going to be within that domain, it's just telling different areas related to that domain. So it's really important to understand this when it comes to looking out for spam and those sorts of things, because the only part of the domain on a link that is important and valid is anything before a slash and between the beginning of the address and the first slash. And so if you get an email from 63543.outlook.com/Google .com/something else, that is not a Google email. That is not a Google link. That is a random Outlook link. If you get a bit.ly/Facebook terms and conditions, that is a spam address. Bit.ly is a platform that you can use to shorten or hide email address, hide domains. And it's a service that is free and you can go on, and the idea is it's supposed to be to create shorter URLs that are easier to remember. But what you need to know is just because a service is available doesn't mean that it's always used for good. So that's how to understand your internet address, your domain. And we recommend that as a business, you should own the domain as close to the name of your business that you can. And you don't necessarily need to own loads and loads of domains. You just want to make a good impression. Things that you can't use dots in the domain. You can now use hyphens. You can't use underscores. And so those are just sort of some of the things to keep in mind. So the DNS settings are like internet directions. So the DNS settings are set on the server, which is where your content and information is saved. Your DNS settings are set on your domain registrar, and they point to the server where you need the information to go. So there's a number of different kinds of DNS settings, and you'll hear these when you're working in the online space. But DNS settings are going to give the directions. When someone types something into the URL, it's going to decide where something needs to go. So when someone types in www.google.com, that's going to send someone to Google's website server and the page that has the search engine on. If you type bianca@gmail.com, that's going to send you to an email server. It's going to direct that piece of information on the internet to the email server. The DNS settings also confirm to other services that you own that address, and they're used for some other things as well. You might you might have some sort of tracking systems that you put in there. You can use it so that you can use a particular email address on your email marketing, or you can have a particular URL on your course website. All of that information is going to be stored in your DNS settings. And there are a number of different ones. TXT settings are text settings. MX settings are mail exchange settings. So that is, MX records are always to do with email servers. And you normally have multiple MX records because you want to have different priority records. So there's usually a priority 1, 2 priority 5s, 2 priority 10s. But it's just, I'm just letting you know what to expect, that there's going to be a bunch of these things. CNAME records are records where you are telling people what that domain, where to point that domain, and an A record is your main record. And you can only ever have one A record, and an A record is going to tell the server, tell the internet where to point information to with a proper email, with a proper internet address. And internet addresses are a bunch of numbers. but they realized that having just a bunch of numbers, which kind of tells people which server and where you are and those sorts of things, is really difficult for people to understand. So we developed URLs which are going to point to that particular address. So just like we have longitude and latitude, and we don't use that to tell people where we live, we tell them that we live at a certain number on an address. The same way you will, it's easier to use a URL to point people to your address rather than giving them the server address in internet numbers. So email address, you need to have mail storage. So you need to have a couple of different things in place when you own a domain and you want to have a website and receive emails. So firstly, you need to purchase the domain and have a domain registrar, and that is where you would update any DNS settings. Sometimes one company will do all of the things I'm about to talk about, but sometimes it's worth having different companies do each of the separate parts. So with regards to email addresses and mail storage, firstly, you need to say where to send the emails. So again, you need to have a storage that you pay for. So it's where the emails are stored and then where to send emails from. So you are going to need to tell the internet using MX records that the emails need to go to the server, and from that server you will access it, and then you also need to be able to send those emails. So again, you need to have MX records. So you need to have an email server that you subscribe to. You may pay for it with the hosting that you have for a website, or you may pay for a separate service provider like Outlook or Gmail or Rackspace, and there's a few others that are out there. So your email storage is going to be paid for, and you will have limits on how much you can have in that space. Again, if you think about if you were buying a storage, well, I mean, even if you're renting a postbox, you only get so much space in the postbox. When your postbox is full, no more mail can fit into it, and so you start losing mail. If you don't go and check your email or retrieve your mail from your postbox, it gets too full and you stop receiving mail, or mail starts to get lost. The same thing can happen with your email. And so it's important that you understand how much storage you get, what counts towards that storage, and how you can clean up and sort out your inbox so that you are maximizing your ability to store mail. And then again, you need to know where so when you type up an email and click send, you need to have everything set up so that it sends from that mail server and the internet knows what to do with that information when you click send on your computer. So that's what email addresses and mail storage and the things that you need to kind of keep in mind when it comes to that. Your website is your home online. You then have to decide whether you need www or not. It's not as necessary anymore. It used to be that almost all email addresses had the World Wide Web, www, on it, but nowadays everybody kind of lives on the internet. But again, all of those files and all of that information, all of that data that is involved in your website has to live somewhere, which means that you need to have a server. And so your website server and your email server may not necessarily be the same place, but they could be. And if they are, then your email storage could affect how much storage you have for your website and vice versa. So it's important to know how these things interact with each other. Another thing to keep in mind is that your server where your website lives requires maintenance, just like if you were living in a house or an apartment or something like that. It would require maintenance, and it needs to be looked after, it needs to be cleaned, it needs to be kept up to date, and those sorts of things. So it's really important that you understand that your website has to live somewhere, that those files have to live somewhere, that it has to be kept maintained and updated, and that you need to have some sort of control over it, because you need to be able to access it or a developer needs to be able to access it in order to assist you if something goes wrong. So it's really important that you have access to your web servers as well. Now, as with when you live at home, when you live in a house or a home, it sort of matters where you live. You could live in a large apartment block. It's a big building. It's very social. There's possibly quite a lot of noise. And that is the same with web servers. You could purchase a website server space on a large shared server with shared hosting. It can be quite noisy in a digital sense. There's a lot going on. You don't get a huge amount of space, and you don't have a lot of control over what you can do in that space. You could then also, once you upgrade from the apartment block, you may choose to go and live in a high-end gated estate. So you've kind of got two options. You can go into a high-end gated estate, or you can go into a suburban home. So high-end gated estate, maintenance is generally managed for you, but you've got more space, you've got a little bit more say, but you're still fairly restricted. And these are things like high-end server offerings that are out there. They're giving you more space. It's a little bit more luxurious. You can do a lot more with what you've got there. You maybe get some perks that are included, which are really useful, but it's still not completely under your control. Were you to move to a suburban home, this is maybe somewhere where you are sharing services like the electricity and the water and the maintenance and those sorts of things, but you have a lot more control over your own home. You have to do your own maintenance. You have to make sure that you look after the property, but you've got your own space and you can do what you want to with the space that you've got there. And so that is kind of like a self-hosted offer where you are actually doing a lot of the maintenance. You are looking after the server. You could also get something like that from a developer, but again, you're relying on people to help you keep it running. And then finally, once you've really made it in the world, you might get a large private land with a completely custom built house. And this is where you have your own server and it's run by your own IT department or you run it yourself, but it is completely customizable. But again, you're still constricted by the amount of space. You just have a lot more space. So it's just kind of, it's helpful to think about server space and those sorts of things in this context, because when you're in a large apartment block and there's lots of small websites, when there's one really loud, noisy neighbor, it affects a lot of people. And it's exactly the same with digital noise. If you are on a server that is like a large apartment block where there's maybe hundreds or thousands of people sharing the same server, and one of those websites gets hacked or has a lot of traffic, it can pull the value from your own website and you stop getting as much bandwidth, and it can cause issues. So it's just something to keep in mind. Where you live really matters when it comes to your internet home as well. And then finally, I think it's really important that you keep in mind that you should own your online identity. Just like this image, you don't want business on the top and pajamas on the bottom. The Zoom era is over. You need your email address and your website domain to match. You really should not be using things like at Gmail, at Outlook, at Telkom SA. Any domain that isn't the same as your work email address, you shouldn't really be using for work emails. You want to get a cohesive look and feel of yourself online. And so it's really important that you chat to the people that you work with in your internet space to ensure that you have your email address and your website matching, and that you understand a little bit more how all of the pieces fit together and why it's important that they all look the same, and that where you are on the internet really matters. And if you're looking for help with this, WAM Workspace is able to assist you. We do domain registration. We do hosting, more like a suburban home, but we will help you manage it. We specialize in WordPress hosting, but we can also help you set up a Gmail account, a Google Workspace account in your domain so that you can send and receive emails using all of the power of Google in your business, but looking like you belong to your website. So please, if you're interested in knowing anything more about any of this, please reach out to us at whamworkspace.com or whamworkspace.co.za.